welcome back to part 5 of the Binny's Whiskey Hotline series on American Brandy, which has been sprawling and in-depth, to say the least. So Dan Farber's back. I'm Pat, along with Brett from the Whiskey Hotline, of course. This week, we're talking to Peter and Sarah from Rhine Hall. Peter's one of the distillers there. Rhine Hall is on the west side of Chicago, and they specialize in whole fruit fermentation, which is pretty damn cool and very different than some of the brandies we've talked about so far. So Peter and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a while that we talked about Rhine Hall here. So, I mean, really, where do we start with Peter? I guess, how did you end up
maybe a little
this?
bit. Does anybody, I guess we have to review, does anybody, I don't know how many folks were with us when we were talking to Jake Parrott, but we kind of got a little bit at that point as a lead into this, talked for at least half of one of the episodes about eau de vie. And Dan has kind of weighed in, and Dan's our co-host with the technical expertise that can talk about how big of a pain in the ass it is to try to work with whole fruit.
Yeah, well, so Peter, I mean, Rhine Hall is only making whole fruit distillation, right?
Yeah.
And is this something you had to train in before you started working there, or were you just kind of like, well, we do this, so figure it out?
Yeah, pretty much. I first kind of learned the basics of distillation working on a little farm in Portugal, where they were distilling Madronio from the strawberry tree, and also doing grappa there. So I kind of learned the very rudimentary style distillation on a little pot still in a shed in Portugal. And then I came back to Chicago, where I was living before that, and tried to get a job here, and kind of told them I knew more than I did, but then learned the ins and outs of the system here. So yeah, I've been here for about 4 years. We've been here as a company for just under 8. But like you said, we do eau de vie style whole fruit fermentation, mostly from fruit native to the Midwest. So apples, pears, plums, cherries. But we also dabble in some whole fruit fermentation that with more tropical fruit. We've had some success with mango, pineapple, banana. But yeah, it can get pretty messy in here.
Yeah, that's wild. Now, apple's probably the flagship, right? If we're going to call it flagship.
Yeah, apple and grappa is where we started. And that was kind of out of the background of our co-owners, Charlie and Jenny Solberg, who are a father-daughter team. And Charlie learned Austrian eau de vie production when he was playing hockey in Austria. So then he brought those skills back here and kind of turned it into a hobby with apple to start. Yeah.
That's cool. Now I see a pot and a column behind you. Does everything get run through both?
Yeah. So we've occasionally played around with flipping up our plates and kind of roughly going through our column, mostly just using the pot, but almost 99% of what we do, we're running through the pot and the column with all 4 plates intact. We've got a 250-liter Holstein here, steam heated, and it seems to suit our purposes pretty well.
And then for equipment and like having gone through, the Holstein is pretty traditional, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what is it? How about, is that column, is that something traditional to any of the European eau de vie producers?
Yeah. So Charlie actually met the guys over at Holstein when he was in Austria and made some small batches of eau de vie with them and some of their friends. So they pretty much told him that this was the style that he should bring back to the US from what they're used to using in Austria. So as far as my understanding goes, this is what the group of Schnapsmeisters, as they like to call themselves, like to use. Pretty much down to a T. So he kind of replicated their Holstein system.
Schnapsmeisters. That's a title we're striving for.
Exactly.
I mean, how many more years do you have to do this before we can refer to you as a Schnapsmeister?
I have no idea, but I know several of them aren't alive anymore. So got some time.
Well, hopefully the Schnapsmeister didn't kill him.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is the sort of thing where we could just sort of all put it on our business cards collectively, and that could be just like one more line underneath.
I don't think anybody's really going to question it, though. It's just obscure enough that if it says Schnapsmeister, you're going to be too embarrassed to ask what it is, so you just kind of don't call anybody on improperly using it, right?
Exactly.
Be correct. So
There, you got to add it
spending
to yours.
spending last 4 years as an educator in Brandy, if you know anything, you know almost 120% more than most of your audience. So if you want the title, I think it's up to you to earn it for yourself, and truly get in there. But I can promise, and the most of the audience we speak to, they won't know. So you could fake it till you make it, you know?
so I had the opportunity to meet with Charlie and Jenny probably 10 years ago, because I started speaking to them about this idea a couple years before, year and a half to 2 years before they actually came up with the facility. And this is a familiar conversation for other craft producers that met with me, because I looked at it, I said, they told me what they wanted to do, and I said, you're out of your minds. And I said, and I probably can't even sell any of that, but let me know if you get it up and running, and we'll give it a shot, and we'll give it a try. So at the beginning, knowing that was you were entering a market, or Rhine Hall was going to enter a market that wasn't particularly robust, especially in the Midwest, even for imports, let alone maybe one other producer in the United States, which was Clear Creek out in Oregon, doing anything remotely like it on any kind of scale. What was like the original, was they were rolling around, what was the original intention? Was it going to be to do, what was it going to be to do eau de vie traditionally, or was there some intention of aging and sort of bridging a gap between what the schnapps tradition would be and something brown, which is what was going on in the whiskey revolution in the United States?
Yeah, originally it was, they wanted to make eau de vie, because probably before they were talking to you, they were making eau de vie in their backyard. So they've kind of been doing that with a backyard system for 20 or 30 years now. So at that point, Charlie had kind of figured out what he liked to make, and he just figured that he wanted to do it on a larger scale. So I don't think he was really dabbling in much barrel maturation at that point. Really just sticking to clear eau de vie spirits. But then once they decided to do it on a larger scale and made the investment on the Holstein still, they kind of also decided that we dabble in some barrel aging. And now about 2/3 of our portfolio is still clear eau de vie stainless steel aged, and about 1/3 are moving into more barrel aged maturation style spirits.
Well, so maybe a good place to go. So we've kind of talked about, we've done some historical stuff, and we've talked about what production sort of looks like at Laird's, which is a very large scale aged apple brandy producer and applejack producer. And we've also talked to Dan and walked through Osacalis and talked about what is an American brand, but is done using a lot of very old world styles. Maybe it's a good time for you to sort of walk us through what goes on with whole fruit fermentation. Like, what's your process that's different than what would be done with traditional grape brandy?
Yeah, so starting maybe just with apple, because that's our flagship at this point. So we work with a couple growers in Southwest Michigan, about 2 hours away. We'll get a variety of apples from them a couple times a year, usually about 8 to 13 different varietals. And that's anywhere from your grocery store blends to cider blends. And we kind of like having a broad spectrum, from Golden Delicious to something like Cortland or Dabinet that has a little bit more acid. So we really run the spectrum with different kinds of apples that we use. We'll bring those in to our facility, about 20,000 pounds at a time, to fill all of our fermentation tanks. And the physical process of whole fruit fermentation, we bring in friends, volunteers, whoever wants to. We'll bring in a crew of folks to hand sort through all of our fruit to pick out any moldy or not so great fruit, so that we can have a better fermentation. Then we'll hand load any of our pomaceous fruit or fruit that doesn't contain pits through a chopper, which I can rotate this here in a moment and show you, which kind of shreds that fruit that can really that can be shredded. So that guy, the upright piece of equipment's got spinning blades on the inside of it, and that's also from Holstein as well. So that's an import that we use for apples and pears, and that shreds our fruit. That then gets collected in this hopper and pumped through our liquid mash pump into our fermentation tanks. So each processing varies a little bit depending on the fruit, but for apples, say that's where we'll start, and then we'll fill all 5 of our fermentation tanks, and then we do have a little bit more of a rustic system, and we don't do any fermentation control. We'll fill them up and usually ferment for 2 to 3 weeks, and then we'll distill. Some of the difficulties. Oh, sorry, what was that?
And that's all spontaneous fermentation. Are you inoculating, or is that spontaneous?
We do inoculate.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're not using the natural yeast of the fruit. We did originally. We had a few issues, and we've started to inoculate, and we've been pretty happy with how it's turned out. So we'll pitch yeast, ferment for generally 3 weeks, and then distill the whole fruit. There is a degree of separation from the cake that forms on our mash that will generally reincorporate the whole thing to get some consistency, but depending on the fruit, we'll allow for that separation to a degree. And we'll start distilling, and the further down we go in our tanks, we do start to have a little bit more cleaning to do in our still as it gets thicker.
I would imagine. Now, you said the ferment is 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, how do you determine when it's done? Are you just purely looking at a gravity or an alcohol reading, and then as soon as that's ready to go, it goes to the still?
Exactly, and also depending on the time of the year, in the sense of a rustic system, the ambient temperature in our space really will have an impact on the pace of the fermentation. So we'll monitor it both on the bricks, the temp, and really decide whether right at 2 weeks is good to go, or 3.5. It depends on the fruit and time of the year. So
do you pump over or punch down?
We pump over. Yeah, to a certain degree, depending on the fruit. If we're dealing with a fruit that contains larger pits, we try to allow for a bigger separation of thicker mash. But for the most, we pump over.
And then Dan, I'm trying to remember too, because you have a different set of stills. When you were doing apple brandy, you were running apple brandy through the Charente. You were not putting whole fruit in the Charente, were you?
No. So those styles of brandy, the aged styles of brandy from France, and what we do here are based on clear ciders, not whole fruit. So this is a very different style of brandy that we're talking about today.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have run cider on this before, and it was almost unpleasant compared to our whole fruit mash. A little too intense. Whereas I think our whole fruit mash enables a certain robust quality and some more of those phenolic compounds to come through in our hearts that we really appreciate in our ends. Spirit.
Yeah, and your intent is completely different. I mean, that's the good point, because what you're trying to do and what Dan would be doing, making what is almost like a Calvados style brandy, are two completely, because yours, and we kind of discussed this a bit last week, right? The difference between distilling for aging and distilling for drinking, and how a distiller makes significantly different decisions depending upon what the end use is going to be. I mean, Dan?
Yeah, but I was gonna pick up on this a little bit later as we walk through it. I imagine that these spirits are also aged, but aging there's a wide range of things. I think most consumers really don't understand the process of aging, and they think of it, they think of these white spirits as not being aged. And correct me if I'm wrong, you guys do age these spirits, do you not?
We do, yeah.
And that's usually a misunderstanding, that these things are not aged. Then you go to things that are produced for aging, which really means that they're produced to transform themselves during this process. And then there's just sort of the clock time of aging, right? So you have spirits that we're talking about today, which typically you don't think of as aging, and hopefully you'll talk about what that does, because I think it's really important. Spirits that are made for aging, but for, way out in the future. And that completely decouples the clock from these two processes. I mean, it's there, but it's not like one-to-one coupled, right? So maybe I
well, we should probably, so then I probably just announce the Oscar winners on Saturday night instead of waiting for Sunday. So what problems, just why we're still talking about the fermentation and how you're processing for eau de vie, what talk a little bit about, because this is one of the fascinating things, is again why you guys are great to talk to at Rhine Hall, because we have talked in the past about how difficult it is to get distillate. So you guys have done some tropical things like mango and pineapple. And I know when I was there a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about dealing with mango. And I know with Jake Parrott in our earlier series on aromatized wines, we talked about distilling pineapple. And I think Dan talked. So what was it like working with mango and pineapple?
Very, very sticky, to say the least. Yeah, it was a bit of a mess in here, and we're still finding little pockets around our distillery where we somehow missed the mango or pineapple on the floor. Also, yeah, I was here the first time we did a pineapple ferment. It was a lot more vigorous of a fermentation, even giving a lot of space in our tanks for head space. It blew out a number of our fermenters and ended up all over our space. So it was, trial and error, and it was different having higher sugar content. Our apples, pears, plums are generally in between anywhere 10 and 13 bricks usually, whereas mango we're starting at 17. So having a higher sugar content, we're really we got to treat the ferment different and be a little bit more we got to plan it out a little bit better. As far as distillation goes, the amount of pectin in the mash as well has really been the biggest issue with mango, and that it usually coats the inside of our still. So those runs that are usually an hour and a half or 2 hours become 3-4 hour runs. So not to mention the mess, the time that it takes to heat that mash up. Once you get a layer of pectin on the inside of your still, it can really cut into our production.
And how do you deal with, isn't that potentially a big precursor to methanol?
Yeah, so we'll have to increase our cuts, and we've experienced that in particular when using an enzyme to break down the pectin. Will particularly boost that methanol, but we'll take bigger cuts on the front end for mango than other fruits. But yeah, it's usually the cleaning of the still in our tanks that's the biggest hassle with mango.
Well, and you had to then account for, how you obviously had to account for the fact that you're going to foam, right?
Exactly.
In terms of what the load is going to be in your fermenter.
Yeah, in our fermenters and in our still as well. So we've got to leave a lot more head space. So we've kind of had to figure out the right amount of fruit. So instead of bringing in 20,000 pounds, we'll do a little bit less than that to allow for 4 or 5 feet at the top of our fermenters, opposed to 1.5 feet, as well as boilovers in our still. As soon as the pectin can coat the side of the still, the rest of the mash can start cooking and bubble over. So we've got to run our still at much lower temperatures to hit our desired range compared to most of our other more common fruits.
And is that the same issue with pineapple?
Pineapple, not so much. My understanding that it doesn't have nearly the same amount of pectin. So we didn't really have the pectin issue with fermentation or distillation. The distilling was actually pretty smooth. And we tried a number of different techniques with our column, where we distilled some of it without any plates down. We did about half of it fully with all 4 of our plates in action. So the pineapple was actually pretty smooth and came off the still really, really bright and aromatic and interesting. And that one's been a fun spirit to watch develop. As you know, we tried some barrel aged pineapple, which has been pretty fascinating and has evolved over 3 years. But that was,
Well,
yeah.
Well, and Sarah, maybe you can weigh in a little bit on this one too. Because I think that, you're given the task, just like I said, you're given the task of going out there and trying to like evangelize why people should be trying this, not just to bartenders, but also to consumers, why this is important. So what kind of success, or what has your approach been when you're talking to people? Again, hard enough to sell an apple eau de vie or Kirschwasser or cherry eau de vie or whatever, or plum eau de vie. Now all of a sudden you're selling mango and pineapple eau de vie. How do you get people to start getting their hands around that?
I think a lot of it is first understanding, if I'm having a one-on-one conversation, if I'm tasting at Benny's, for example, somebody goes, oh no, Brandy, not going to do it. It's understanding why they're having that reaction and then going back into it with why it might be a different experience with us, and also not trying to force the issue. Many people see our spirits and they go, Brandy is not clear. And you're like, okay, well, what have you had in your experience as Brandy? Like, what are you thinking of that means that you don't associate with us? And how can I get to know you a little bit so that I can maybe scare you a little less with what I have in front of me? And then once you kind of get that, and or you end up with somebody who knows everything, but maybe doesn't have the full scope or the full story. I often tell people, they're like, oh no, I don't drink brandy, I only drink whiskey. And it's like, well, okay, well, what do you like about whiskey? You like the barrel, you like the things. So when we start to introduce barrel in our spirits, it's when I can pull into those sort of things of like, here's why we're different, but why you might like it, and it might be okay. And the same goes for the clear spirits. You have your vodka drinkers and you have your tequila, and now are huge mezcal fans. You have your gin drinkers. And when I explain like, okay, so if you can drink those things, which are also clear, then here's what mine is without adding flavor, without adding juices, without adding sugars. I'm offering you something that's made purely from this one thing. And whether or not you think you'll like brandy, or whether or not you know what eau de vie is, I bet you if you think about it in context to how you would drink your gin or how you would drink your tequila, you will be able to drink this eau de vie. So instead of thinking of it as, it's like more of establishing a relationship of why it's kind of similar to something versus always talking about why it's so different and special. It is different and special, but it's finding the approachability and finding the common ground. So making it more of a conversation and a less of a, this is why we think we're elite and why we think we're fancy. It's like, no, this is why you're totally going to be able to drink this.
Right. And a bit of a pivot out of tradition, because it would be very easy to put your mind in a box and only talk about, what would be coming from Schlatter and Mette and all these traditional Alsatian styles.
Those are things we can get to later once we've introduced, it's like once you can get people on board, then we can take them to like what the different levels and different styles and different things are. But most people don't even understand that the definition of brandy is anything made from fruit in a distillation world. So let alone that there's cultural and different versions of every single style in every single country across the world. So so you just have to, it's baby steps. Right.
So that's sort of crossing in, and this will maybe get us closer now to what Dan had brought up, where I think I jumped the gun a little bit. So let's talk about distillation, Peter, and you're really creating, you're creating the age, and then, the nuance of aging that Dan was talking about, of course, is resting really as much as anything. It's not what we would I think when we think of aging, we think of aging being, you got to put it in wood. So aging is really doing some level of wood extraction, whereas aging would be very traditionally in eau de vie and with fruit brandy, sometimes aging is resting, right? Resting in glass, resting in steel, letting it sit, maybe letting it oxidize a little bit, letting it soft up, getting volatility down. So as you're going through back into the distillation process, how are you running the apple and the cherry and the plum through as a for instance. How are you running through the stills? What is your pattern through the stills on those brandies? Your mic's
You're
up.
muted.
Thank you. Maybe even to step back, because I know we got a question. How do you treat the stone fruits in the fermentation process differently than the non-stone fruits?
So we essentially treat them the same, other than separating the stone to the degree that we can. We use a rubber auger on our pumps here that naturally separates most of the stones that we work with. And that's like the plums that we work with are freestone plums. So those are going to be separated a little bit more than your clingstone plums. Sorry if I have some motorcycle background noise going on here. So as far as the fermentation goes, we essentially do the same thing. It'll really come down to the time based on the sugar content or the time of year that we're fermenting. But we usually use the same yeast, same time and fermentation techniques through to distillation. And we also distill pretty much the same across the board as well. Of course, we'll take different cuts depending on how our ferment has gone. But we've got a kind of uniform style for most of our fruits that grow here in the Midwest.
The pits and the stones aren't in the fermenter then?
They will be in the fermenter.
They will, okay.
For our cherries, we usually have a certain amount of them de-pitted before we process, because those are a little bit harder to split from the flesh themselves, whereas the plums, we can more naturally separate those from the pit, and then those will sink to the bottom of our fermenters and we can separate them out later.
What about a mango? Those are they're like such a pain in the ass to pit, right? I mean,
yeah, luckily we don't deal with the pitting of the fermentation. We get them in a kind of pre-chopped,
okay.
separated. Yeah, I'm glad that we don't do that. Otherwise,
Yeah, what a nightmare that would be.
So and then weigh in and just and maybe some explanation why, because there's some subtlety to the question why, and probably the reason why the question was asked originally. And why are you separating, particularly with cherries and some of the stones? Why are you trying to separate those stones out delicately rather than leaving it a little bit more to getting crushed like you might with an apple or a pear?
Yeah, so we don't want them to break. We don't want the release of that prussic acid or cyanic acid. However, a small degree of benzaldehyde is nice to have in our spirit. So it's kind of that fine line of including a little bit of those compounds for a fuller profile of almond, vanilla, marzipan to give some complexity to your spirit, but you really don't want breakage of many of those because it with a high concentration, it can both be toxic and it'll be very bitter. So no fun for anybody. So a small amount of breakage is good, but we won't want all the plums in our fermenter to be broken. That would be a disaster. So it is essential to kind of separate those, both for the health of the spirit, for it to be a enjoyable spirit, and for all the flavor compounds as well.
Well, but it's nice that you've got that early warning system. If you've gone too far, you know it before you're not gonna hurt anybody, because you know that it's there well before, right? It hits a harmful level.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so post fermentation, I mean, you end up with pretty much like a fruit slurry then out of all these different fruits. I mean, there can't be much left as far as a big chunk, right?
Yeah, they're usually pretty liquefied, so that we can run it through the bottom of our fermenters. We use 2 3/4 inch piping, so it's really got to be small enough to cycle through our pump to get into our still. Occasionally with pitted fruits, it'll kind of with fruits that contain pits, it'll create a little bit of a cake and stop a lot of that from going through our fermenters. So there's some work that we got to do there, but generally after 3 weeks of breaking it down and doing pump overs, it's pretty liquefied, where we don't have much issue transferring it into our still from the tanks. So it does become a thick slurry.
And again, and you're running that right into the still.
Running it right into the still. Yeah. Everything goes in. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, as it as we start pumping out of the fermentation tanks, the first half of the tank is automatically going to be much more liquefied, just with the way that gravity and liquid works compared to the second half of the tank. So the deeper cleaning and longer runs are going to come from the second half of any of our fermentation tanks.
And then, so like, how full does that pot get behind you there? And that's, you know, on any given distillation?
We'll run it all the way up to the brim of the tank. I can give you a little closer look at this still here, but it's 250 liters. Our tanks are actually all made by Charlie's sister company. He does some fabrication and steel work out in Itasca. So they made all of our tanks. So these small tanks are roughly 1,000 liters, and those are about 4,500 liters. 4 runs in our 250 liter still here, and we'll fill it all the way up to the edge, and that stir is usually able to handle it. Unless it's pretty thick, then we'll go lower and make it work.
Now, do you get foaming in the still as well?
We do, depending on the fruit, however. Generally with cherries, mango, banana, pineapple, we'll see some foaming. And occasionally we've actually done some beer distillates as well that will always foam with as well. But if we run low and slow enough, we can avoid that. But it'll turn that 1.5 to 2 hour run into a 3-4 hour run if it's going up.
Right.
So it goes through that pot, and it's got that kind of onion head on top that's really just enhancing reflux, right? And then it goes over to the column, and you have 4 plates in the column. What kind of cut do you have to take on these then? And how widely would that vary based on the fruit you're using?
It really depends. With, you know, we'll start with the 250 liter mash. We'll generally end up getting about 12 liters at 80% of most of our spirits. Wow. That are, 10 to 13 bricks that we're finding in the Midwest here. If we're doing something like mango, that'll be a little bit higher, more like 13 to 15 liters, but then we'll be taking up to 2 liters or so, heads, 4 shots, cuts, and then our tails cuts really depend, but we usually take it down to in the 60s range, 60% range. But yeah, it really depends. But as far as the whole fruit with this still, one of the biggest aspects I meant to show you before is emptying the still, because we can't run a lot of that whole fruit down the drain. So we've got a vacuum system where we'll suck a lot of that whole fruit out into a colander where we can then transfer it to compost, which, just give you a brief look back there, is this little tank back there that we'll just use like shop vacs to suck it out. So it works.
Wow.
It does. And then
go ahead, Brett.
And then how much sample, like, because it's getting into, because you talked about your cuts. At what point, and I think this is something else, is some insight when people know you're as you're tasting everything that's coming off the still, you're obviously looking for everything. You have to have a cohesive whole at the end of all the alcohol levels that are coming in. Versus what point in time would you say is your favorite part of the distillation? And how much does that differ versus what the whole combined pieces for, again, for age worthiness and for a lot of reasons and structure, and that what is the sweet spot for what really, like, straight off the still you think is the best, sort of the best taste?
I think apple's another good starting example for that. You know, we'll usually start around 80%, and it'll run around 80 coming off the still for 20 minutes or so. But then when it starts to move down into 78, 77 is really where I think the sweet spot is. The majority of the run is going to be between 75 and 78 before it starts dropping more into the rest of the tails. But I think, yeah, mid 70s is usually my favorite range to get all the brightness of the fruit and some of those, you start to get some of the oils coming through. It's not as hot and ethanol forward as the start. The start of an apple run can be really bright and crisp, but I feel like it gains a lot of its body and richness a little bit further down.
And then what you're taking at the end, you're taking just to give some depth and some structure and some, some body to hold everything up.
Yeah, exactly. And then we'll redistill our tails and we add it back in, and usually we'll have more tails for our last. We'll keep our tails from the bottom thicker part of our fermentations that we'll add back to the top part of our ferment, where it's more crisp, fresh juice and less of the must to kind of even it out.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So I guess so now that you're, where do you go now that you're off the still?
Yeah, so kind of getting back into the maturation part that Dan started talking about earlier, I think the word maturation rather than age is so important, both for clear spirits and for those spirits aged in oak, whether it's the process that a spirit goes through in stainless. It's going to change entirely from the point that it comes off the still to 9 months later, which we usually give our spirit about 9 months, at least 9 months in stainless steel, for those molecules to kind of come together and form bigger cohesive bonds and become a richer spirit. But I think, yeah, maturation we find is also important in stainless steel, but of course important in going into barrel. And we'll generally use the same spirit for both. We have found that spirits that off the still are a little bit more robust and have some of those bigger, oilier compounds are going to do better in barrel, are going to end up having a richer, bigger body to them. So, we're still young, and our oldest barrels are only 5 or 6 years. So we're kind of figuring out what works and what doesn't. But we're starting to see some of those choices we've made earlier on about putting bigger spirits into those barrels, whereas eau de vies that are a little bit cleaner and brighter, I think are better in clear form opposed to going into barrel.
A lot of producers in Europe also hold reserve eau de vies in stainless for extended periods of time. Are you guys experimenting with glass or stainless long-term maturation?
Are you talking about post barrel barrel aging, or just non-barrel aging?
Non-barrel aging, but like 5, 7, 10 years in glass or stainless.
Yeah, we haven't too much. We're trying. We're building our inventory. So we have a couple spirits now that have been in stainless for about 2 years, and we would love to get some older ones. But at this point, we've kind of been turning and burning our inventory about a year aging. But I'm hoping to get to the point where we can build up our stainless inventory where we can do those longer agings, as well as to have the ability to blend different batches of spirit aged in stainless steel. So I think a lot of times if it's one batch aged in stainless steel, it can have all the crisp, clean elements of eau de vie that you look for, but the complexity that you find in oak aged spirits can be a little bit lacking. Whereas I think you can make up for some of that when you blend different spirits that are aged in stainless steel and find some more of that complexity.
And then, so what are the benefits, just so we know, what are the benefits of allowing that liquid just to stay for extended periods of time in stainless?
Yeah, to my understanding, I think that as the ethanol compounds and all the different elements of the spirit spend time hidden away from light and movement, and are able to sit and rest after being fermented and torn apart and heated and cooled, they can form bigger, longer chains of molecules and make the body of the spirit more cohesive and release some more of those flavor and aromatic compounds that they wouldn't necessarily have before. I think that happens equally in barrel with all the addition of oxygenation. But we usually do allow for about a fifth of any of our stainless steel tanks to hold oxygen to enable those reactions as well.
Yeah, and Dan, how does that jibe with what was the genesis, Dan, of like the Alsatian tradition or some of the
No,
German eau de vies and the Austrian eau de vies?
it's really just that. I mean, when you taste these eau de vies, which have been aged for long periods of time in neutral containers, the structure of the mouth, it actually was explained very well. You know, the structure in the mouth just develops a much heftier weight, and the fruit intensity in the mouth really comes on with time. And the nose also gets a bit richer. It's, you know, even young eau de vie is just so gorgeous. I mean, it's so beautiful. The nose actually is in many cases sort of the easiest thing to come around. It's always, you know, if you do everything right, it's there. But that overall structure really is enhanced with aging. But you're one of the few companies in the United States I know that's really experimenting, you know, with that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting.
Well, we've all got credit to pay to yourself and Jermaine Robin. You know, all of the work that you guys have done in the books that Hubert has written are incredibly helpful. So you've paved the way.
No, I always say that, you know, the real conversation we need to have is how to get people to understand how beautiful these eau de vie are and how wonderful they are, you know, after a meal. And to just, you know, I always think of it as the ability to capture the harvest in a glass, right? I mean, especially like in the dead of winter, right? You can almost think of nothing that'll bring summer on, you know, more quickly than sticking your nose in a beautiful glass of eau de vie of kirsch or plum, right? I mean, I wish we could get people to understand how wonderful an experience that is and how well it goes with food.
Yeah.
It's always amazing to me how adverse wine drinkers often can be to fruit brandy or eau de vies or brandies in general. They'll talk to me consistently about how much they love, you know, they've gone to such and such vineyards and they know the differences of their grapes and are doing all these things. And then I explain some of the differences in terroir and in fruit and nothing to do with it. So it is interesting to try to blend those worlds and find common language. But there's still such a pushback that I often find is linked into modesty and like being proper in sipping or shooting spirits and sort of the difference between two. And so that it often is a conversation of more of well, I don't drink alcohol or I don't, you know, so I think it has to evolve into a whole conversation, not just about eau de vie and not just about fruit spirits, but just like kind of exactly that, like how special it is to be able to like take something that happened a year ago, 5 years ago, and smell all of that and like know that it was a really wet harvest or that it came when it was 110 degrees at Rhine Hall and we had pears that we could smush with our hands and like all of those things, and you can taste and smell all of that. It's there, but you have to kind of bring people in on a whole of knowing that it's okay to sip spirits and that it's not evil or hard.
Yeah. Right, and explain the fruit. I mean, I've got one of the things that I've got in front of me that I had. We've got some of the aged experiments that you guys have done with plum and pineapple, but I've got just the cherry, which is probably my favorite of everything that comes out.
It's gorgeous,
and but it smells like a fresh, like almost like a fresh Morocco cherry, right? That bright, just really, really beautiful, bright, almost bordering on citrusy sort of character off the nose that, you know, I think to what Dan and Sarah both have said, that's exactly that people don't understand. It's like, how can you not want to stick your nose and drink some of this?
Yeah.
When you smell that fruit.
Yeah. The past 2 years have been a little rough on cherry harvests in the Great Lakes region. So we produced a little bit less these past 2 years than we normally would. So I'm hoping that this year we can go ham and fill our distillery a couple times with cherry. So hopefully we'll be able to build up an inventory of cherry to both increase our eau de vie inventory and fill some barrels.
Has Michigan started blossoming? Do you know?
I'm not sure. We'll usually check in with our cherry farmer in April and May. So we'll find out in the next few weeks.
And then Dan, where are you sitting? Where's he going? Where are you sitting with are we going to see a blossoming cherry? What's that?
You're muted again, Danny.
Dan, you're muted. Dan, you're muted.
So we're just beginning blossom on the early apples out here. So
So there, and how was New York? Actually, are there any cherries growing when you were out in New York last week? I know
there are,
that
but it's still early. I mean, just early. So their normal bloom time for apples would be sort of end of April. So they're about a month, on average, a month behind. So, and we just had plums blooming here a couple weeks ago. So.
we're going to be eating apples off that tree in the fall.
That's a cider apple. So yeah, you will.
Well, that's okay.
And
They're
you'll
fine.
enjoy
They're
it. You'll
sour.
enjoy it. It's a bitter. No, it's not sour. It's bittersweet. It's actually, I like it. The rest of the house doesn't, but so be it.
We had a question here regarding the the oxidative environment in these stainless tanks, and how oxidative or reductive is the environment in a stainless tank, and how does that differ versus using neutral oak for those same kind of purposes?
Our tanks are sealed, so we'll allow for a certain amount of oxygen in our tanks, but it's not as if there's oxygen passing through like a warehouse, like a rick house. Rather, there's oxygen that is sealed in there. And yeah, again, only about a fifth of the space will allow for oxygen space.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really see we don't see like a angel share loss or reduction of our spirit with that aging. At least I haven't noticed. If it is, it's pretty minimal, or a heightening of our ABV. So really not, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference on the oxidative quality, but in the sense of it maturing and transforming, whether it's acetaldehyde into acetic acid, or those further transformations, it seems like with the heightening of all of those aromatics, it seems like all of that definitely does continue in stainless steel tanks as it does in barrel.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. That's always a piece that I've always thought. I didn't get any of that until the first time somebody presented me Mete from Alsace, and why is this $70 a half bottle? Why is this, or $100 a half bottle? It's like, well, and then of course then you get into the old, well, because it's 6 years old or it's 7 or 8 years old. I just, no, it's not. Look at it, it's clear. And then that was the beginning of sort of understanding exactly where that came from.
No, but I mean, I might, bitch and moan about the cost of producing brandy from grapes and this, that, and the other thing. But when we're talking about things like kirsch or plum or, these other eau de vie, these are absolutely some of the most expensive spirits in the world to produce. I mean, sure, there's this aspect of like, why is this bottle, so expensive? But when you're talking about what Rhine Hall's doing and the sources of fruit, you're talking about something which is really quite precious from its inception, and I think it's hard, like as consumers, I think we get our head on like a size, right? That a size thing is worth a certain amount of money. Like, so $750 or $375, we have it in our head, like what that's worth. And we forget that there's a wild difference in what it takes to make the kinds of things that they're making here versus other things.
Sure.
So I think something that helps us kind of explain that to people when we do a breakdown, and this is something that is perhaps different from things like grains, and that we average in a 750 about 25 pounds of fruit. And when you visualize what 25 pounds of fruit is, and you think that's it, this is all we got out of 25 pounds of fruit. I think that helps sort of understand, and that, you know, it's done by the hands of, you know, sometimes as little as 5 or 6 people from start to finish it, and these days fewer. So I think when it is a little bit more of a hand fed story versus, and hopefully one that is, this category maybe becomes more understood, will be something that is easier to explain, and people will see the value and the joy in it.
Well, so one of the things you guys are doing since we're on, which is sort of, you know, taking a traditional style, but sort of making it your own a little bit. And Peter, but you know, I met with you to talk, or Charlie called me originally and asked me to come by and swing, is the Sippers Club. So you're doing some of these less conventional, you know, more conventional or less conventional brandies aged now and playing along. So where do you guys sit with progress on that project?
Yeah, so we age primarily in New American oak. We've started for the past 6 years in 25-gallon barrels. We are progressing into 53 gallons. We've done both toast and char. Up to this point, most of our blends are in toast barrels, and we're starting to hit longer age statements. So 3 to 5 years on a lot of those, which is still pretty young, but we're starting to get some really interesting spirits out of our barrel aging. But as far as the Sippers Club, we, you know, as we create our blends from usually anywhere from 3 to 8 barrels, we do a reserve apple, reserve plum, cherry, pear, all of those we do barrel age statements of. So as we create blends of each, we'll find particular barrels that we think are really cool. You know, not every barrel is going to be an A+. You know, a lot of them are interesting, but they're great for blends, whereas some barrels are just phenomenal on their own. So having an audience where we can taste those barrels and be able to not put those in our blend has kind of been our thought process with the Sippers Club, which we just started this past year. So this past weekend was our second Sippers Club, where we tasted through 3 different barrels of plum brandy, 1 2-year and 2 3-year aged plum brandies, and then we did a pineapple barrel aged brandy as well. So it's we're just kind of getting things started and figuring out how the format of it is going to be rolling forward. But you know, we're excited to taste through these really interesting barrels and see how it goes.
No, and that blend gets towards something that, you know, we discussed when we talked to Dan about Osacalis, which again sort of harkens back a little bit more to a regimen that would be more common in Cognac or Armagnac, or which are the blends, and taking all those, now that you've developed all these barrels of different age and different character, at what point in time do you start combining them to try to get, you know, sort of like a whole greater than the parts?
Well, when, you know, just like when I used to distill for Bonnie Doon, Randall, who had made eau de vie for many, many years, had this beautiful notion, and there was a wonderful blend. It's not in the market anymore, hasn't been for years. Prunus, right? So it was a cross of all these across the genus. So there's like wonderful opportunities with all the things you have. I can't wait to taste some of the things you're doing. Personally, I think it's fantastic, and what a great palette to be able to work with.
Well, we've got some that can come the next time we give you a shipment of Tempesta or Bari Foods pepperoni, we can send some of the prune and pineapple brandy your way.
Yeah, Dan, I would love to bring one out to you to sunny California and spend a few days out there.
Oh yeah, that's a February. No, I want to be there in February. I forgot.
Right.
Dan likes the cold. So Peter, what's the strangest thing that you've had to work with to distill? And do you have like a favorite thing that you've distilled there?
starting with favorite, I think one of my favorite things to distill here is grappa. Right off the still, it's big and rich and juicy, and it can be so representative of the wine varietal that it's distilled from. So we'll use different pumice from a couple wineries around here, City Winery or Vin 312 up in Ravenswood. And the process itself is a lot more labor intensive, but I think the distillate is one of my favorites as far as the process goes. And I think right off the still, it's just so interesting. So that's probably my favorite thing to distill. As far as weird goes.
I mean, when I think weird, I think Brett mentioned the Mete eau de vie earlier, and they have, like mustard and dill and like these things, these eau de vie made with herbs and stuff.
Right.
That it's just like,
Well,
totally
their gastronomique series, because they did garlic, basil. They had a thyme. They were really, really cool, actually.
The most classic example of all time of it's really fun to taste, but you have no idea what the hell to do with the rest of the bottle, though, especially for what they were charging.
It's for cooking, right?
Exactly.
If you're cooking, it's like $130 a bottle.
Right before.
No, but how much, Dan? So how much of that would you need, Dan, if you're cooking with that, like with that Mete aioli? What? How much of that would you actually use, depending upon, or what kind of dish would you use it in, and B, how much would you use?
It's totally different, right? Because you can dress something with it. You don't have to. You wouldn't want to cook it, really, right? It's for cooking, but it's really for dressing, and like it's like perfuming a dish, right? With garlic or dill or I mean, it's like it. So I'm not the chef, but I know sort of the concept anyway.
You could also do similar applications in cocktails. I wouldn't measure out a 2-ounce cocktail of any of those things, but we talk about misting a glass with things like an anisette or and using it as a varying degree to kind of like give you, sometimes I even mist eau de vie over the top of a cocktail to improve that quality, because even in cocktail form, you have to smell as much as you can in order to get the full experience and the full flavor profile. So putting something like that in an atomizer would add a really amazing depth and cool process to maybe even the most simple cocktail. Maybe you're making a martini and you want to take your dirty martini to a whole new level. Who wouldn't want to take something like garlic or I mean, that to me is just like, it would blow some minds. It would take people to a whole different place. So although those bottles are very expensive, there is an application, and it may not be sitting and sipping like this. It may be being used to engage the senses in other ways. And how cool is that exists?
Yeah, using them sparingly as that kind of finishing layer.
Yeah.
The salt-based salt, so to speak,
Yes.
Totally.
Just that finish touch.
Right before I started, they distilled a onion brandy, which is
really,
it's a lot. Yeah, you want to try it, but then 8 hours later, you'll dread that you did it. It stays with you.
I did it once.
Yeah, it's in the tasting room. So the next time, Brett, you come by, or the next time I swing through, I'll have to remember to pull the bottle. It's exciting.
Oh yeah,
Wow,
gotta
that's
try
wild.
that.
Yeah.
Instead of the pearl onion in the martini.
Yeah. Great for
It's a whole new Gibson. It's just its whole own, yes.
Wild. Hey, Ode to Me asked a follow-up question on any plans for doing some more exotic fruits like rambutan, mangosteen, jackfruit, even durian, LOL. That would be cool, but I would imagine it's hard to get those fresh enough, at least in the quantity that you would need.
Yeah, it was actually, Jenny and I were talking about this today because, right now until July, our fermentation tanks are going to be empty until we get cherries, unless we find some kind of quality fruit, which are tropical fruits. We're looking for mango right now. We're also talking about maybe trying to play around with some Japanese fruit or something else that we haven't done before. But at the moment, no solid plans, so I won't lead you on too far.
Yeah, that's he is a big fruit fan. I know, that's why kind of he was asking this. Our friend Paul wants to know if he can get a piece of this onion brandy. and he suggests pairing it with a Chicago hot dog. So
Yeah, well, no,
From my
Old-to-me
tasting
said
room,
he
yeah.
always, actually, Old-to-me said that he always misses Chicago hot dog with mustard Old-to-me, which would be,
Yeah, you can come
yeah,
out,
Sarah said if you come to the distillery, she'll figure it out for you.
bring your own Chicago dog though.
And your own mustard Old-to-me.
I will take payment in the form of Chicago hot dogs and mustard Oatovy. Absolutely.
We gotta find. We have a couple of those weird metes open somewhere, I think. He says pair with Mars's pickled Berliner Weiss. Now you've taken this too far.
We've
God.
gone away.
Maybe that's the real
Wait.
Chicago handshake.
Wait, Mars did a pickled Berliner Weiss, and I haven't tried it yet.
That is a Brett beer if I've ever heard one. Okay, I don't know. Do we have any other questions for Peter and Sarah for whole fruit distillation this week? This was pretty damn thorough.
No, this was fantastic. This
Yeah.
was fantastic. This fits in. I think that next week we're talking about, now we're really running the gamut. Our next, just for folks that have been following along through all 5 weeks, our next step is we want to talk to somebody about that is running a larger distillery, and we're targeting having somebody from Gallo, McCall, so we possibly David Werder, who is sort of in charge. Dave's in charge of their distillery operations, basically.
Yeah. Yes, he is.
Okay,
All right,
so
cool.
so that's what we're targeting next, just to go on this journey. But
Opposite end of the spectrum for sure.
Right.
We're
Yeah,
going
and
from a
about-
250 liter Alsatian still to those pot stills are probably like what, 10,000 liters or something.
Oh, they're 24 hectos. So yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
those are, because they're running too, right? They're running the columns in Fresno, but then they're also running the old Italian, like the big Italian stills.
They have, Dave would have to answer that. I know that McCall is up and running. They have columns in the north, columns in the south. They have a lot of stills. And it
But
really,
what was the old Centauri facility that they refurbed and just reopened?
that's McCall. That's McCall.
Right.
That's all the Poulos, the Charente stills, all Charente
Okay.
stills.
Okay.
Wow. All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much. Sarah, thank you. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for
Everybody
having us
else,
on.
I guess we'll be back Monday with big box brandy. Although that kind of sounds detrimental and I don't mean it to.
And we'll know they can make it. Sarah, real quick for Sarah and Peter, when can folks stop by Rhine Hall? Where are you located, and when can people when can folks stop by Rhine Hall and visit you?
Yeah, for the time being, we've reopened our tasting room limitedly as we're working back to bringing our staff back, but also just working with having available outside and inside space. So we're open Friday and Saturday to the public. Reservations are not required, but they are available to book. You can go to our website or to our talk page for that. And we do everything from cocktails to just spirit tastings. We're happy to do any of those things at this time. And hopefully we're going to look towards the end of April, early May to bring back our public tour platform where we'll be able to do things a little bit more openly and with groups of folks that might not necessarily know each other, but are also happy to accommodate private groups on a small scale.
Cool.
Okay, and bring your masks, everybody, so we can all stay
Please.
safe and
Yeah.
keep rolling.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
Peter and Sarah, thank you again. Dan, always a pleasure. And everyone who tuned in, thanks for listening. And I guess we'll see you next week. Brett and I will be back on Wednesday talking whiskey with Sonoma Distilling, talking some rye and bourbon with some funky finishes. And yeah, so we'll see you Wednesday and we'll see you next Monday. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Ciao.
Cheers.
I love
Thanks.
this
Cheers.
cherry. I'm going to finish this. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.